On October 29, 1956, inside the Empire Theatre on London's Leicester Square, two women stood just feet apart. One wore a diamond tiara and white gloves. The other wore a gold dress so revealing that half the room couldn't stop staring, and the other half pretended not to notice. One was the Queen of England, the other was the Queen of Hollywood. And when their hands touched for the first and only time, something happened that neither royalty nor celebrity could have predicted. But the real scandal wasn't the dress. It wasn't the broken protocol. It wasn't even what Joan Crawford said afterward. The real story is what these two women, born just 6 weeks apart in 1926, secretly thought of each other, and how one night in London revealed a truth about both of them that the world was never meant to see. To understand how this extraordinary collision happened, we need to go back to the very beginning, to two girls, born into two completely different worlds, whose paths were set on a collision course from the moment they took their first breath. In the spring of 1926, on April 21, a baby girl was born at 17 Bruton Street in Mayfair, London. The time was recorded precisely, 2:40 in the morning. Her name was Elizabeth Alexandra Mary. Her father was the Duke of York, the second son of King George V. Her mother was Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, one of the most admired women in British high society. The birth was attended by the Home Secretary, as was tradition for royal births, a custom designed to prevent any possibility of an impostor being substituted for the real heir. Servants prepared the nursery. Telegrams were dispatched across the empire. Newspapers carried the announcement on their front pages. The world was formally informed that a princess had arrived. She was third in line to the throne, behind her uncle Edward, the Prince of Wales, and her father. Nobody expected her to become queen. Nobody expected the constitutional crisis that would change everything. But that crisis was still a decade away. For now, little Elizabeth was simply a princess, adored by her parents, raised behind the gilded walls of privilege at 145 Piccadilly in London, and at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park. She had a governess, a nursery, a world of order and routine and certainty. She learned to curtsy before she learned to read. She learned her place in the world before she understood what the world was. 6 weeks later, on June 1926, 3,000 miles away in Los Angeles, another baby girl entered the world. But there were no telegrams, no home secretary standing by, no gilded nursery waiting. Norma Jean Mortensen was born at Los Angeles General Hospital, in the charity ward. Her mother, Gladys Pearl Baker, was a film cutter at one of the Hollywood studios, a woman who worked long hours for modest pay. She was financially broken, emotionally fragile, and already beginning to show signs of the devastating mental illness that would consume the rest of her life. The father listed on the birth certificate was Martin Edward Mortensen, but the spelling of the surname was wrong. His address was listed as unknown, and Gladys had separated from him before the pregnancy even began. The real father was never conclusively identified. Some biographers believe it was a man named Charles Stanley Gifford, a co-worker of Gladys at Consolidated Studios, but Gifford denied it, and Norma Jean would spend her entire life searching for the truth about her father, a search that never ended. Within 2 weeks of her birth, Gladys placed her newborn daughter with foster parents, Ida and Wayne Belenda, a couple in Hawthorne, California, who took in children for money from the state. Gladys paid them $25 a week from her wages. She visited on weekends sometimes, but Norma Jean would later tell interviewers that for the first years of her life, she called her foster mother Mama and thought her real mother was simply the woman with the red hair who appeared on Saturdays and then vanished again. Two girls, two continents, two completely opposite starts to life. One born into a world where every detail was planned, every moment accounted for, every future already written in golden ink. The other born into chaos, uncertainty, and abandonment, a world where survival was the only lesson that mattered. While Princess Elizabeth was learning to wave from the balcony of Buckingham Palace, Norma Jean was learning something altogether different: how to disappear into the background, how to be quiet, how to not cause trouble, how to make herself small enough that the adults around her might forget she was even there. In 1933, when both girls were 7 years old, their lives took sharp turns that would define everything that followed. That year, Gladys Baker made one final desperate attempt to be a mother. She scraped together enough money to purchase a small white bungalow in Hollywood and moved Norma Jean in with her. For the first time in her entire life, the little girl had her own bedroom, her own mother under the same roof, her own address, a home. It lasted less than a year. In early 1934, Gladys suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown. She was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and was committed to Metropolitan State Hospital. She would spend most of the remaining decades of her life cycling in and out of psychiatric institutions, sometimes aware of her daughter's existence, sometimes not. The little white bungalow was gone. The dream of a normal family was gone. And 7-year-old Norma Jean was sent back into the system, back to the foster homes, back to the uncertainty, back to the feeling of being unwanted. Over the next 8 years, she would be shuffled through at least 11 different foster homes and spend time in an orphanage. She was tall for her age, painfully thin and awkward in her second-hand clothes. Other children mocked her. Teachers overlooked her. And in at least one of those foster homes, according to accounts Marilyn gave in later interviews, though the details varied each time she told the story, she was sexually abused. When she told her foster mother what had happened, the woman refused to believe her. Nobody believed her. Nobody protected her. Nobody chose her. Meanwhile, in England, Princess Elizabeth's world was also shifting, though the nature of the shift could not have been more different. On December 10, 1936, Elizabeth's uncle, King Edward V, made the announcement that would reshape the British monarchy forever. He abdicated the throne, gave up the crown, the empire, and everything that came with it, to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee whom the Church of England refused to accept as queen. It was the greatest constitutional crisis in modern British history, and its most immediate consequence fell on the shoulders of Elizabeth's father, the quiet, stammering Duke of York, a man who had never wanted the throne, who struggled with a severe speech impediment, who was happiest in the company of his wife and daughters, was now King George VI, and his 10-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, was heir to the throne of the largest empire the world had ever known. The story goes that when young Elizabeth was told her father had become king, she turned to her younger sister Margaret and said, "Does that mean you will have to be the next queen?" Margaret reportedly replied, "Yes, someday." Elizabeth's response was characteristically understated. "Poor you." But it wasn't Margaret who would wear the crown. It was Elizabeth. And from that moment forward, every single day of her life was preparation for a role she never asked for, never chose, and could never escape from. Her education shifted. Her public duties began. Her childhood, what little remained of it, was over. In 1942, when both women were 16, the contrast between their lives reached perhaps its starkest point. Princess Elizabeth was making her first formal public appearances, inspecting troops as Colonel-in-Chief of the Grenadier Guards, stepping into the ceremonial duties of a future sovereign with a composure that startled observers who expected to see a nervous teenager. By 1945, she would join the Auxiliary Territorial Service, learning to drive and maintain military trucks and ambulances. She was the first female member of the royal family to serve in the armed forces, a fact that would remain a source of quiet pride for the rest of her life. At 16, Norma Jean faced a very different kind of decision. Her guardian, Grace McKee Goddard, a friend of her mother's who had taken on responsibility for the girl, was relocating to the East Coast with her husband. They could not afford to bring Norma Jean with them. The teenager was presented with two options: return to the orphanage she hated or get married. She chose marriage. On June 19, 1942, 16-year-old Norma Jean wed James Doherty, the 21-year-old son of a neighbor. She had been dating him for 6 months. By most accounts, they were happy together, at least initially. Doherty would later describe her as a sweet, generous, and religious girl who liked to be cuddled. But when Doherty was deployed overseas with the Merchant Marines in 1944, Norma Jean was left behind, alone again, just as she had always been. She took a job at a radioplane munitions factory in Burbank, spraying fuselages and inspecting parachutes. And it was there, on the factory floor in the summer of 1944, that a photographer from the Army's 1st Motion Picture Unit spotted her. His name was David Conover, and he was taking photographs of women contributing to the war effort. Images meant to boost troop morale. One look at Norma Jean and he knew he had found something extraordinary. Something the camera loved in a way that defied explanation. She began modeling. She bleached her brown hair a brilliant, unmistakable blonde. She divorced Dorothy in June 1946 and signed a film contract with 20th Century Fox. And she changed her name, adopting her grandmother's surname, Monroe, and the first name of a Broadway actress, Marilyn Miller, whom she had always admired. Norma Jean Mortensen was gone forever. Marilyn Monroe had arrived. By 1953, she was the biggest movie star on the planet. Gentlemen prefer blondes. How to Marry a Millionaire. The 7-Year Itch. The film with the iconic subway grate scene that became the defining image of American sexuality in the 1950s. Her face appeared on every magazine cover in America. Her image appeared on the most famous calendar ever printed. A nude photograph she had posed for in 1949 when she was broke and desperate for $50. She married baseball legend Joe DiMaggio in January 1954, a union that lasted 9 turbulent months before collapsing under the weight of his jealousy and her ambition. But behind the smile, behind the breathy voice, behind the carefully constructed persona, Marilyn Monroe was suffocating. She was tired of being typecast as the dumb blonde by studio executives who refused to see her as anything more than a profitable body. She was tired of being controlled. So in 1954, she did something that stunned Hollywood to its core. She walked away from her studio contract with 20th Century Fox, moved across the country to New York, and enrolled at the prestigious Actors Studio under the legendary Lee Strasberg. She formed her own production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, one of the first female-led production companies in Hollywood history. She was done being a puppet, and it was this act of creative defiance, this determination to be taken seriously, that would eventually bring her face to face with the Queen of England. In February 1956, Marilyn Monroe and Sir Laurence Olivier held a joint press conference in New York that set the film world buzzing. Olivier, widely regarded as the greatest stage actor of his generation, perhaps the greatest in the English-speaking world, had flown from London to announce a film collaboration that seemed, on paper, like the event of the decade. The film was to be called The Prince and the Showgirl, an adaptation of Terence Rattigan's play The Sleeping Prince. Olivier would produce, direct, and star in the title role. Opposite him, playing the American showgirl, would be Marilyn Monroe. For Marilyn, this was everything. A chance to work alongside genuine theatrical royalty. A chance to prove that she was more than a body, more than a breathy voice, more than the punchline of 1,000 Hollywood jokes. Olivier was her personal hero. The man who had made Shakespeare accessible to millions, who had won Academy Awards, who commanded the respect of every serious actor in the world. Working with him would legitimize her in a way that no number of box office hits ever could. For Olivier, the calculation was simpler. Marilyn Monroe was the most famous woman in the world. She would bring audiences to a film that might otherwise have been dismissed as a polished but minor comedy. It was a business decision wrapped in artistic prestige. On June 29, 1956, just weeks before filming was scheduled to begin, Marilyn married playwright Arthur Miller in a 4-minute civil ceremony at Westchester County Courthouse in New York. They married again 2 days later in a Jewish ceremony at the home of Miller's agent near Katona, New York. Marilyn had studied Judaism and converted for her husband, desperate to be welcomed into his family. Miller was considered the greatest American dramatist of his generation, the man who wrote Death of a Salesman and The Crucible. The writer Norman Mailer called it the marriage of the great American body and the great American brain. On the back of one of her wedding photographs, Marilyn scrawled 3 words in her looping, childlike handwriting: "Hope, hope, hope." 2 weeks later, on July 14, 1956, Marilyn Monroe arrived in London. It was a rainy English day, grey and damp, but the woman descending the aeroplane steps at London Airport made the entire tarmac feel sunnier. Beside her was Arthur Miller, tall and bespectacled and slightly bewildered by the pandemonium. Waiting to greet them on the ground were Laurence Olivier and his wife, the legendary actress Vivien Leigh, Scarlett O'Hara herself. Cameras flashed in rapid succession, reporters shouted questions, fans pressed against barriers. England was gripped by what the newspapers would call Marilyn fever. The biggest star in the world had landed, and the country could barely contain its excitement. She brought 27 pieces of luggage. They weighed 861 pounds. The couple was driven to Parkside House, a stately mansion in Englefield Green, Surrey, owned by Lord Drogheda. The property was nestled in the lush English countryside, surrounded by ancient trees and rolling lawns, and backed directly onto Windsor Great Park. It was a world away from the cramped apartments and hotel rooms Marilyn was accustomed to in New York and Los Angeles. The house was grand, the silence was deep, and Marilyn, who was used to the constant hum and chaos of city life, felt immediately uneasy. It didn't take long for her unease to be justified. Within days of moving in, Marilyn discovered that Lord Drogheda's servants were selling stories about her to the British tabloids. Her private moments, what she ate, what she wore around the house, how late she slept, whether she argued with Miller, all of it was being leaked to reporters. She felt watched, she felt invaded. She felt, once again, like the girl in the foster homes, surrounded by people, but utterly alone. And then the filming began, and everything got worse. Pinewood Studios was a world-class production facility, but the atmosphere on the set of The Prince and the Showgirl was toxic from the very first day. Olivier, meticulous, disciplined, trained in the classical English tradition of precise blocking, clear diction, and technical mastery, could not understand Marilyn's way of working. She was a method actress now, trained by Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio, taught to access genuine emotion through personal memory and psychological exploration. She needed time, she needed space, she needed multiple takes to find the truth of a scene. Olivier had no patience for any of this. He found her slow, unfocused, difficult. He could not comprehend her tendency to become distracted while taking direction, which he interpreted as rudeness or stupidity. He raised his voice in anger, he insulted her intelligence. And in one moment that became infamous in Hollywood lore, he snapped at her with 3 words that cut to the bone of everything Marilyn had been fighting against her entire career. Just be sexy, 3 words, that's all it took. For a woman who had spent years trying to escape the prison of her own sex appeal, who had moved across the country and enrolled in acting classes, and formed her own production company specifically to be taken seriously as an artist. Hearing "just be sexy" from the man she admired most in the world was devastating. Marilyn responded by retreating into herself. She relied increasingly on her acting coach, Paula Strasberg, who had accompanied her to London and whose presence on set infuriated Olivier to the point of barely controlled rage. She began arriving late, sometimes an hour, sometimes 3 hours, sometimes not at all. She took sleeping pills at night and stimulants in the morning, and moved through her days in a fog of medication and misery. And then, somewhere in the middle of this professional nightmare, Marilyn found something in her husband's private notebook that broke her heart. According to multiple biographers, Marilyn discovered Miller's journal one evening at Parkside House. In its pages, he had written notes expressing deep doubts about their marriage, about her, about them, about whether he had made a terrible mistake. The exact words have been disputed by different biographers, but the impact on Marilyn was immediate and irreversible. She later told close friends that she never fully recovered from the discovery. Their marriage was barely 3 weeks old. Their honeymoon was supposed to be in England. And now she knew, or believed she knew, that the man she had married out of hope, already regretted choosing her. But through all of this, the war with Olivier, the crumbling marriage, the medication, the loneliness of that too-large house in the Surrey countryside, Marilyn had one dream, one obsession, one thing that kept the spark alive behind her increasingly exhausted eyes. She wanted to meet the Queen. Parkside House in Englefield Green sat just 4 miles from Windsor Castle. 4 miles. On clear days, Marilyn could see the outline of the castle grounds from her windows. She and Miller had even obtained permits to ride bicycles through Windsor Great Park. And they did, pedaling along the ancient pathways like any ordinary English couple out for a weekend ride. The proximity to the Queen ignited something in Marilyn, a fascination with the royal family that grew more intense with every passing week. According to her publicist, Alan Arnold, Marilyn's ultimate dream was to be invited to Buckingham Palace for tea with the Queen. She asked about it repeatedly. It became a daily request. Arnold dutifully added it to his list of things to arrange. But the tea invitation was never extended. And Olivier, who reportedly grew weary of what he considered Marilyn's increasingly unreasonable demands, allegedly removed the royal request from the list on more than one occasion. And then, in the last weeks of October, everything changed. An invitation arrived, not for tea at Buckingham Palace, but for something far more public, far more spectacular, and far more significant. Marilyn Monroe was formally invited to attend the Royal Command film performance at the Empire Theatre in Leicester Square. She would be presented to Queen Elizabeth II in person. The girl from the foster homes was going to meet the Queen of England. But first, there was the matter of what to wear. A memo was circulated in advance of the event to every female celebrity on the guest list. The instructions from the organizers were clear, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. You must wear something conservative. You must think about the neckline. Joan Crawford received the memo. She followed it to the letter. Brigitte Bardot received it and made appropriate adjustments. Anita Ekberg acknowledged it. Every actress on the list took note, every actress except one. The memo, in the words of author Michelle Morgan, went straight over Marilyn's head. Marilyn already knew exactly what she was going to wear. She had visited a theatrical dressmaker in London. Not a fashion designer, not a couturier, but a theatrical costumer, someone accustomed to making garments that were designed to be seen from the back row of a theatre. She brought a small hand-drawn diagram of what she wanted. The dressmaker followed her instructions precisely. The result was a gold lame evening gown, floor-length, skin-tight, and the neckline plunged so low that, according to Morgan, the tops of Marilyn's breasts were on full display. The gown came with a matching glittering gold cape and a small gold clutch bag. It was so form-fitting, so sculpted to Marilyn's legendary figure, that several people were required to help her into it. This was not conservative. This was not thinking about the neckline. This was Marilyn Monroe at her most unapologetically, defiantly, gloriously herself. October 29, 1956, London. A cold autumn evening. The Empire Theatre on Leicester Square is ablaze with light. The Grand Marquis announces the evening's film, The Battle of the River Plate, a war picture about the Royal Navy's pursuit of a German battleship. But nobody outside cares about the film. They care about the people. Hundreds of fans have packed the square, pressing against police barriers, straining on tiptoes for a glimpse of the arriving stars. Officers on horseback maintain a measured calm. Flashbulbs explode in the darkness like miniature white suns. Inside the theatre's spacious foyer, the most famous faces in world cinema are assembling in a long, carefully arranged receiving line. The scene is extraordinary, a collision of eras, continents, and star power that would be almost impossible to replicate today. Joan Crawford, the Grand Dame of Hollywood, stands near the front of the line in a perfectly appropriate, perfectly conservative evening gown. Her posture is flawless, her expression is controlled. She has followed every rule, observed every protocol, and she expects everyone else to do the same. Nearby stands Brigitte Bardot, the 22-year-old French sensation whose film And God Created Woman had just made her the most controversial actress in Europe. Bardot is nervous. She has been worrying about her curtsy all day. Victor Mature, the broad-shouldered American action star, looks calm on the surface. But he will later confess that he was so terrified about meeting the Queen that he couldn't remember a single word she said to him. Anita Ekberg, the Swedish bombshell, waits with quiet poise. Norman Wisdom, the beloved British comedian, fidgets with boyish energy. Peter Finch, Anthony Quayle, Sylvia Sims, Mary Ure. The line stretches the entire length of the upstairs lounge, and then there is Marilyn. She arrives at the theatre in a car with Arthur Miller. When the door opens and she steps onto the pavement, the cape is draped across her shoulders, partially concealing the dress beneath. She smiles, that famous incandescent, impossible to look away from smile, and walks through the entrance. Inside the foyer she pauses. The cameras are trained on her. The room is watching. And then, in a gesture that was pure Marilyn Monroe, theatrical, bold, completely deliberate, she throws back the cape. The gold dress is revealed, the neckline plunges, the fabric clings to every curve. The lame catches the light and throws it back in shimmering waves. Conversations halt mid-sentence across the room. Heads turn. Somewhere in the line, Joan Crawford's lips press together in a thin, disapproving line. Marilyn takes her place in the receiving line, positioning herself next to Victor Mature. She is more than halfway down the queue, not at the prestigious front, not tucked away at the back, but somewhere in the vast middle. And as the minutes tick by while she waits for the Queen to arrive, something begins to happen. The confidence fades. The Hollywood armor cracks. The smile starts to flicker. She is nervous. Not the glamorous, performative nervousness of a movie star playing coy for photographers. Real nervousness. Deep, physical, visceral nervousness. The kind that makes your mouth go dry. The kind that makes you lick your lips over and over without realizing you're doing it. Rubbing away your lipstick layer by layer until there's nothing left. The kind that comes from a place so deep inside you that no amount of fame or beauty or golden dresses can protect you from it. Because underneath the gold lame, underneath the platinum hair, underneath the persona she had spent a decade constructing, Marilyn Monroe is still Norma Jean, still the girl from the foster homes, still the girl nobody wanted, still the girl who was told she wasn't enough, would never be enough, could never be enough. And that girl is about to touch the hand of the Queen of England. She peeps out from behind Victor Mature's broad frame, craning her neck to watch the Queen moving slowly, gracefully down the line. She turns to Mature and chatters excitedly, her words tumbling out in a rush of barely contained anticipation. Then she looks ahead again, waiting, watching, licking her lips. Queen Elizabeth II enters the foyer with her sister, Princess Margaret, and Lord Mountbatten. The Queen is wearing a magnificent evening gown, the Grand Duchess Vladimir tiara sparkling atop her carefully styled brown hair, the Delhi Durbar parure, emeralds and diamonds, gleaming at her throat. She is composed, regal, measured, every inch the monarch. Beside her, Princess Margaret wears a rose and gold brocade gown that catches the light with a different kind of radiance. The Queen begins moving down the receiving line, handshake by handshake, smile by smile. Reginald Bromhead, the president of the Cinematograph Trade Benevolent Fund, walks at her side, discreetly consulting his notes to ensure he introduces each celebrity correctly. The Queen exchanges brief pleasantries with each star, a comment here, a nod there, a polite question that demonstrates she knows exactly who each person is and what they have accomplished. And then she reaches Marilyn. Queen Elizabeth stops. She looks at the woman standing before her. There is a brief, unmistakable glance. The Queen's eyes travel down, then up, taking in the gold dress, the plunging neckline, the sheer audacity of the outfit. It is not a look of shock, it is not disapproval. The Queen, as author Michelle Morgan would later note, was very aware of who Marilyn Monroe was. She knew her reputation, she knew her films, she knew her fashion. Elizabeth was far more connected to popular culture than the British public ever realized. Marilyn takes the Queen's gloved hand, and then she drops into a curtsy, a perfect, graceful, well-rehearsed curtsy that she had practiced repeatedly in the days and hours leading up to this moment. Whatever Joan Crawford would later claim about Marilyn not knowing how to curtsy, the footage tells a different story. The curtsy is flawless, and then they talk, not for a few seconds. Not for the polite, perfunctory nod that most celebrities received before the Queen moved on. They talk for several minutes, an unusually long exchange for a receiving line, and one that several observers noted with raised eyebrows. The Queen speaks first, and what she says catches Marilyn completely off guard. "I've heard that we're neighbors." Marilyn blinks, her famous blue eyes widen. Her first reaction, according to Morgan's account, is a bewildered, "Eh?" The Queen offers that small, characteristically subtle smile, the same smile that diplomats, prime ministers, and heads of state would come to know over the next 7 decades. "Well," she says, "I live in Windsor Castle. You live in Englefield Green, which is right on the boundary." And something shifts. The nervousness drains from Marilyn's face like water from a tilted glass. The Hollywood mask, the carefully constructed, painstakingly maintained persona of the world's greatest sex symbol, simply drops, and in its place is something genuine, something unguarded, something that looks, for just a moment, like a little girl who has been told the most wonderful secret. "Oh!" Marilyn exclaims, suddenly animated, suddenly girlish, suddenly overflowing with a happiness that has nothing to do with performance or cameras or red carpets. Me and my husband ride our bicycles through your park. The Queen of England and the Queen of Hollywood are talking about bicycles, about neighbors, about parks, about the simple, ordinary, wonderfully human experience of living near someone and sharing the same paths. Two women born 6 weeks apart in 1926, living 4 miles apart in the autumn of 1956, discovering in a receiving line at a movie premiere that their worlds are closer, in the most literal geographical sense, than anyone had ever imagined. The Queen then moves on. Princess Margaret steps forward. Marilyn curtsies again and engages in another warm exchange. They discuss cycling, life in England, progress of the prince and the showgirl. And then Marilyn does something characteristically, irresistibly bold. She leans in and says, with genuine enthusiasm, "You must come and see my husband's play." Arthur Miller's A View from the Bridge was running at the Comedy Theatre in London, and Marilyn was so delighted, so genuinely thrilled that the royal sisters were still talking to her, still interested in her, still treating her like a person rather than a spectacle, that she couldn't contain herself. The princess smiles, the moment passes, the receiving line moves on. The evening continues. The film is screened, the audience applauds, the stars file out into the cold London night. But something happened in those few minutes that went far beyond protocol and pleasantries. Something that photographs captured, but words can only gesture toward. As Marilyn swept through the Empire Theatre's exit that night, she was a different woman from the one who had arrived. The nervousness was gone. The lip-licking had stopped. The girl who had begged off the earlier rehearsal, who had fidgeted and fretted and peeped anxiously from behind Victor Mature, that girl had vanished. In her place was someone brimming with confidence, with joy, with the particular kind of radiance that comes from being seen, truly seen, by someone who matters. Reporters swarmed her as she approached her car outside the theatre. What did she think of the Queen? What did they discuss? Was she nervous? Marilyn was, by her own admission, giddy. "The Queen is very warm-hearted," she told the assembled press, practically bouncing on her heels. "She radiates sweetness. She asked how I liked living in Windsor, and I said, 'What?' And she said that as I lived in Englefield Green, near to Windsor, we were neighbours. So I told her that Arthur and I went on bicycle rides in the park. She was excited. She was giggly. She was, for perhaps one of the last genuinely happy moments of her public life, completely and unself-consciously delighted. But not everyone shared Marilyn's joy that evening. Joan Crawford, the formidable Hollywood legend who had been engaged in a public and private feud with Monroe since a notorious incident at the 1952 Photoplay Awards, was not impressed. Crawford had arrived at the Empire Theatre in a perfectly conservative gown, had followed every instruction in the dress code memo, had curtsied with impeccable precision, and had conducted herself with the rigid propriety that she believed all actresses owed to the occasion. And then she had watched Marilyn Monroe throw open a cape and reveal a dress that violated every single guideline. According to biographer Sean Considine, Crawford delivered her verdict with characteristic venom. "The Queen is a lady and expects to meet other ladies, but most of today's actresses can't even act politely." That night, as Her Majesty came up the stairs, Monroe's hairdresser was still doing her hair, and the girl didn't even know how to curtsy. The last claim about the curtsy was demonstrably false. Footage of the event clearly shows Marilyn executing a perfectly graceful curtsy. But Crawford's bitterness was never really about the curtsy, or even about the dress. It was about something deeper, a generational earthquake in Hollywood that Crawford could feel beneath her feet but could not stop. She represented the old guard, discipline, decorum, the studio system, the iron control of personal image. Monroe represented the future, raw authenticity, sexual liberation, a refusal to be contained by anyone else's rules. Crawford was watching herself become irrelevant, and she was furious about it. Ironically, the other great blonde icon in attendance that evening had precisely the opposite reaction. Brigitte Bardot, whose own film And God Created Woman had scandalized European audiences with its frank sexuality, praised Monroe's gold gown openly. She later recalled the evening with a mixture of awe and genuine admiration, insisting that Monroe was the real star of the night, Radiant, charming, fragile, and utterly unforgettable. Years later, Bardot would reflect on the moment with melancholy, noting that Monroe's particular combination of beauty and vulnerability was something that the fame machine would eventually consume and destroy. Bardot was right, but that destruction was still 6 years away. The most revealing reaction of all, however, came not from Hollywood, but from behind the ancient walls of Buckingham Palace. In a private conversation with close friends, the kind of conversation the Queen almost never had about specific individuals, Elizabeth shared her impression of the evening, and what she said was not what anyone would have expected from the most reserved woman in the world. "I thought Miss Monroe was a very sweet person," the Queen reportedly said, and then she added something extraordinary. "But I felt sorry for her because she was so nervous that she had licked all of her lipstick off. Felt sorry for her." The Queen of England, the most powerful woman in the world, the head of state of nations spanning every continent, looked at Marilyn Monroe, the most famous woman in the world, the walking embodiment of glamour and desire, and her response was not admiration, not judgment, not disapproval, not amusement. It was compassion, pity, a recognition of the trembling, terrified person behind the dazzling facade. She had seen past the gold dress, past the platinum hair, past the plunging neckline that had scandalized Joan Crawford and delighted Brigitte Bardot. The Queen had seen the nervous girl underneath, the girl licking her lipstick off, the girl shaking with anxiety, the girl who wanted so desperately to be accepted, to be worthy, to be enough. And instead of judging that girl, the Queen felt sorry for her. A friend of Elizabeth's would later reveal that the Queen was fascinated by Marilyn afterward. The monarch who famously never spoke publicly about individuals, who maintained an impenetrable wall of discretion for 70 years, who kept her personal opinions locked behind a diplomatic smile that never wavered. That woman could not stop thinking about the nervous American actress in the gold dress. Two women, born 6 weeks apart, living 4 miles from each other in the quiet English countryside. Both trapped, one by duty, the other by image, one bound by a crown she never chose, the other bound by a persona she could never escape. And in the space of a handshake and a conversation about bicycles, they had recognized something in each other that transcended titles, tiaras, and lame gowns. They were both, in their own ways, prisoners, and perhaps they both knew it. Marilyn Monroe left England on November 20, 1956. She and Arthur Miller posed for final photographs at London Airport with the Oliviers, smiles fixed, tensions carefully concealed from the cameras. The 4 months in England had been among the most tumultuous of Marilyn's life, professionally devastating, personally shattering, and punctuated by that single extraordinary evening at the Empire Theatre that she would never forget. The Prince and the Showgirl premiered in June 1957 to mixed reviews and disappointing box office returns. Critics noted, with some surprise, that despite the behind-the-scenes warfare, Marilyn was luminous on screen while Olivier appeared stiff and uncomfortable. Dame Sybil Thorndike, the distinguished veteran actress who had worked with Olivier for decades, delivered the most devastating verdict of all. Monroe, she said, was the only one out of the whole company who knew how to act in front of the camera. Olivier, stung by the experience, would not direct another film for 14 years. The Miller marriage, already fractured by the Notebook discovery during their so-called honeymoon, continued its slow, painful disintegration over the following years. Marilyn's dependence on prescription drugs intensified. Her behavior grew increasingly erratic and unpredictable. She had an affair with French actor Yves Montand during the filming of Let's Make Love in 1960. Miller, for his part, emotionally withdrew and eventually developed a relationship with Austrian photographer Inge Morath, whom he married in 1962. By the time Miller wrote The Misfits as a vehicle for Marilyn, a film that also starred Clark Gable and Montgomery Clift and was shot in the brutal Nevada desert, the couple were barely able to be in the same room. They divorced on January 24, 1961, exactly 1 week before The Misfits premiered. Miller did not attend the opening. In the final year of her life, Marilyn was fighting battles on every front. She was fired from the film Something's Got to Give by 20th Century Fox for chronic absences and erratic behavior. She was rehired. She was fired again. She gave interviews to major publications. Life magazine Vogue in what appears, in retrospect, to have been a desperate attempt to reclaim control of her public image. She was only 36 years old, but she looked older. She was tired. The machine that had created Marilyn Monroe was grinding her to dust. On the evening of August 4, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her bedroom at 12305 Fifth Helena Drive in Brentwood, Los Angeles. An empty bottle of Nembutal, a powerful barbiturate, lay on the nightstand. The coroner's official verdict was probable suicide. She was 36 years old. The girl from the charity ward, the foster homes, the orphanage, the girl who had transformed herself into the most desired woman on earth, died alone in a modest bungalow in the dark. Conspiracy theories erupted almost immediately and have never fully subsided. Her connections to President John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy fueled decades of speculation about possible murder, government cover-ups, and silenced witnesses. The truth, whatever it may be, has never been conclusively established. But what is certain is that Marilyn Monroe's death at 36 closed a chapter in American cultural history that has never been replicated and never will be. The news reached every corner of the world. Whether it reached the private chambers of the Queen is not recorded. Elizabeth said nothing publicly. She never did about private matters. That was not her way. But those close to her have said that the Queen never forgot the woman in the gold dress. She remained, in the words of one friend, fascinated by Marilyn for years afterward. In 2011, when the film My Week with Marilyn was produced, starring Michelle Williams as Monroe and Kenneth Branagh as Olivier, Buckingham Palace reportedly gave rare permission for some scenes to be filmed inside Windsor Castle, though the palace never officially confirmed this. Monroe and the Queen never saw each other again after that October night in 1956. They shared no further public words, no confirmed private correspondence. Their encounter lasted minutes, not hours. It produced one conversation, two curtsies, and a single observation about bicycles. And yet, it became one of the most iconic meetings of the 20th century. Queen Elizabeth II died on September 8, 2022, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. She was 96 years old. She had reigned for 70 years, 7 months, and 1 day, the longest reign of any British monarch in history. She was served by 15 prime ministers, from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss. She met 13 American presidents, from Truman to Biden. She witnessed the dissolution of an empire and its transformation into a commonwealth of 53 independent nations. And through all of it, through abdications and assassinations, through wars and scandals, through divorces and deaths, and the relentless grinding pressure of being the most scrutinized human being on the planet, she remained. Constant, unwavering, a fixed point in a world that never stopped spinning. Marilyn Monroe died 60 years before the Queen, at exactly half her age. And yet, in many ways, her cultural legacy has proven equally enduring. Her face is still among the most recognized in human history. Her image still generates hundreds of millions of dollars. Her name is still shorthand for a particular kind of beauty, luminous, vulnerable, impossibly fragile. And her story, the story of an unwanted girl who reinvented herself as a goddess and was then destroyed by the machinery of her own fame, still resonates with anyone who has ever felt unseen, unloved, or trapped by the expectations of others. They were born 6 weeks apart in 1926, one in a London townhouse, attended by ministers of state, the other in a Los Angeles charity ward, attended by nobody who mattered. They lived 4 miles from each other in the autumn of 1956, one in a castle, the other in a borrowed mansion with servants who betrayed her. They met once for a few minutes in a receiving line at a movie premiere on a cold October night. And in those few minutes, something extraordinary passed between them. Something that the cameras captured in black and white, but that words can only attempt to describe. 2 women, 2 crowns, 2 cages, and one brief, shimmering moment when the walls came down. The Queen saw the girl behind the glamour, and the girl from the foster home saw, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, that even queens can be kind. One lived to 96, the other died at 36. Together they occupied the same world for just 36 years. But the image of their meeting, the white gloves reaching for the gold dress, The tiara reflected in the nervous, hopeful eyes of the most famous woman in the world. That image has outlasted them both, and it always will. And that is the story of the night Queen Elizabeth II met Marilyn Monroe. A story of two women born 6 weeks apart into opposite worlds, separated by everything and united for one unforgettable moment on a cold London evening in October 1956. A story of duty and desire, of tiaras and foster homes, of crowns and cages, of a queen who felt compassion and a star who just wanted to be seen. If this story kept you watching, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. We've got more royal scandals coming that will leave you speechless. Drop a comment and tell me, if Marilyn Monroe had been born a princess and Queen Elizabeth had been born in a Los Angeles charity ward, do you think their lives would have turned out differently? Or were they always destined to become exactly who they were? I read every single comment. Until next time, this has been Pure British Scandals.